7 years. 7 long years of silence, speculation, and shadows. The world thought the story of Jerry Lewis ended the day he was laid to rest in 2017. His coffin lowered while cameras flashed and fans mourned a man who had once made millions laugh until their sides ached. But stories don't end when the body disappears. They linger, they fester, they wait for the moment someone brave enough finally cracks the silence. And now, after 7 years of waiting, that moment has arrived. The revelation didn't come from a journalist digging into the archives or a biographer publishing a glossy tell-all. It came from blood, from Jerry Lewis' own son, a man who had spent his life in the shadows of both genius and chaos. He had lived the childhood no one saw, carried the weight no one clapped for, and bore the scars no audience ever applauded. 4 years, he had refused to speak. Not a word, not a whisper. Silence had been his shield. But time has a way of stripping defenses, and grief has a way of curdling into truth. The world knew Jerry Lewis as the clown prince of comedy. The pratfalls, the ridiculous voices, the slapstick brilliance that electrified screens from New York to Paris. They knew the telethons, the charities, the red carpets where Hollywood bowed to him as if he were royalty. But what they didn't know, the man behind the mask, the father behind the spotlight, was about to be laid bare in a confession that would shake the legend to its core. It began almost accidentally. The son hadn't planned it, hadn't rehearsed it. He had sat down for what was supposed to be a routine interview on another project. Just another day in a studio filled with lights and questions. But then the interviewer, perhaps emboldened by the tension in the room, asked it, "What was it like growing up as Jerry Lewis' son?" A question so simple, so ordinary, but so loaded it could have detonated a minefield. The silence that followed was unbearable. For a full 10 seconds, he didn't move, didn't breathe. His eyes dropped to the floor. And then, with a shaky inhale, he let it out. It was nothing like the world imagines. The dam broke. He spoke not with bitterness, but with a rawness that made every word feel like it had been carved into him over decades. He spoke of the laughter that echoed through stadiums, but not through his home. Of the applause that made his father glow in public, but the coldness that froze their family in private. "The man you saw on stage," he said, "wasn't the man I grew up with." And just like that, the silence of 7 years collapsed under the weight of truth. The world, so used to seeing Jerry Lewis as the eternal jester, suddenly found itself peering behind the curtain. This was not the story of pratfalls and charity checks. This was not the story of late-night contracts and standing ovations. This was a story of scars, scars carried by a son who had been invisible for too long. The words spread like wildfire. Reporters scrambled. Fans gasped. Hollywood insiders whispered, "Finally!" Because behind the genius of Jerry Lewis was always the rumor of storms. Storms no one dared confirm, storms his family had endured in silence. Until now. And this was only the beginning. What the son revealed next would transform Jerry Lewis' legacy forever, forcing the world to ask, was the price of his brilliance paid in his own bloodline? But before we dive deeper into those confessions, into the life behind the laughter and the shadows cast by the spotlight, I want to ask you something. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, if you believe the truth behind the legends is just as important as the legends themselves, make sure you hit that like button right now. Share this video with others who, like you, want to see beyond Hollywood's glittering surface. And don't forget to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about Jerry Lewis, it's about every untold truth hiding behind a famous name. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories don't come from the stage. They come from the silence. For the public, Jerry Lewis was untouchable, a whirlwind of slapstick brilliance, a pioneer who rewrote the language of comedy. He could stumble across a stage with perfect clumsiness, trip over his own feet like a marionette out of control, and still make it look like ballet. His genius was undeniable. To millions, he was joy incarnate, a man whose every twitch, grimace, and falsetto shriek carried the cure for boredom and sorrow. But for his son, those performances were something else entirely. They weren't just shows, they were walls. Because when the curtain fell, the man who stepped through the door at home wasn't the same Jerry Lewis who basked in applause. The transition was shocking, like watching a magician dismantle his own illusion. At home, laughter wasn't the soundtrack. Silence was. Authority was. Expectation was. His son remembered watching his father sweep through the house with the same precision he brought to a movie set. Everything had to be perfect. Shoes lined up just so, no toys in the hallway, no interruptions when he was working. "You didn't laugh around my dad," the son said. "You held your breath." The split was dizzying. On stage, Jerry was adored. He was the clown prince's, the eccentric genius, the master of chaos. But inside those walls, chaos wasn't tolerated. Discipline reigned. The children learned early that their lives weren't really their own. If Jerry wanted quiet, there was silence. If Jerry wanted order, there was order. The family wasn't just living in his shadow, they were living in his script. There were rare moments when the mask slipped. His son remembered being small, sitting cross-legged as Jerry tinkered with a tape recorder, laughing with him for just a heartbeat, before the perfectionist snapped back, unable to tolerate flaws, even in his children. The stage was the only place he let himself be human, his son admitted. To the world, Jerry was a saint, limousines, red carpets, telethons that raised billions. But at home, hugs were scarce, if they came at all. His children didn't see a savior. They saw a storm. Some nights he returned glowing, reliving triumphs and celebrity encounters. Other nights, silence reigned, as he locked himself in his study with a drink and a cigarette. On those nights, the family tiptoed, terrified of disturbing whatever anger brewed behind closed doors. The contradiction was crushing. At school, classmates praised him as the funniest man alive, mimicking his voices, his pratfalls. His son would smile and nod, hiding the truth. The man who made the world laugh never laughed with him. What hurt most wasn't the distance. It was the longing. "I wanted the father everyone else had," he confessed. "But he never showed up for me." Jerry's brilliance was inseparable from his perfectionism. Every gag, every movie, every moment was controlled. For his children, that meant life wasn't measured in love or laughter. It was measured in performance, obedience, and whether they were good enough to stay in his orbit. Behind the spotlight, the family lived a very different show. One without applause, without laughter, without the joy the world associated with Jerry Lewis. It was a show no one ever saw, until now, until his son broke the silence. This was where the fairy tale twisted. What the world saw as fame and fortune was, inside the Lewis home, something far darker. Discipline slipped into cruelty, love became conditional, and genius left scars. His son would later call those years a prison, endured silently while the world worshipped Jerry's glittering empire. Hollywood bowed to him, audiences adored him, but power became his addiction, and his family paid the price. At dinners, laughter was forbidden. One wrong word, and the air froze. Jerry could erupt with words sharper than knives or retreat into silences so cold they hollowed the house. "It felt like walking on broken glass," his son said. "Every day, you never knew when you'd bleed." Even when present, Jerry wasn't really there. His children were background actors in the grand production of his life, props to a man who hugged strangers on television but rarely his own family. And then came the demons: long nights, alcohol, whispers of affairs. The shouting rattled the windows, arguments tore through the walls, and the children huddled in fear. "You didn't question him," his son confessed. "You survived him." The money, too, was its own curse. From the outside, the Lewis family looked wealthy. Mansions, cars, private schools. But inside, money was another weapon of control. Jerry decided who deserved his favor and who didn't. "He could give you the world," his son said, "but take it away in an instant." The years became a cycle of control, rebellion, and punishment. Some children ran away, others vanished into silence, but his shadow followed them everywhere, on TV, in magazines, on billboards. They could never escape him. Then came the estrangements. One by one, Jerry's children drifted away, some cut off, others self-exiled. "It wasn't that we didn't love him," his son admitted. "It was that loving him hurt too much." By the time Jerry's health failed, the family was fractured. Some tried to make peace, others couldn't. At his funeral, the grief was tangled, love and anger bound together. "I watched the world mourn a man I never really knew," his son said. and I mourned the father I never really had. The dark years left scars on everyone, including Jerry himself. He was both legend and cautionary tale, proof that laughter and cruelty can live in the same body. And now, 7 years later, his son was ready to speak, not just to confess, but to rewrite the legacy of a man whose genius came at a hidden cost. 4 years, Jerry Lewis' son lived in silence, trapped between memory and myth. He watched anniversaries drift by like clockwork, each one marked by glowing tributes, documentaries, and books that painted his father as untouchable. Television screens lit up with montages of pratfalls, voices cracking into comic shrieks, and audiences roaring with laughter, while commentators spoke of Jerry's genius with reverence. To the world, he was the king of comedy, a man who had brought joy to millions. But to his son, each celebration was a knife twisting deeper. He swallowed the words that burned in his throat, reminding himself again and again that it wasn't his place, that the world had already chosen its version of Jerry Lewis, and no one wanted to hear from the children who had lived in the shadows of his fame. But silence has weight. It is not an absence, but a presence, pressing down harder with every passing year. What began as protection grew into corrosion, eating away at his spirit. He carried nights filled with restless memories, of coldness where there should have been warmth, of expectations where there should have been love. The silence became its own prison, and each year behind its bars grew heavier, darker, harder to bear. 7 years after his father's death, that prison finally cracked. The silence that had shielded him for decades collapsed, and in its place rose the voice of a son who could no longer keep the truth buried. The breaking point didn't come in one dramatic explosion. It came in whispers, in sleepless nights, in the quiet erosion of resolve. He had grown tired of watching strangers own the story of his father while the people who had lived it remained ghosts. It was like watching someone else write your life for you, he said, and getting every detail wrong. The world saw Jerry Lewis as a hero, a philanthropist, a comedic genius who had shaped Hollywood itself. But his son couldn't escape the other side, the nights of terror, the cold dismissals, the relentless pressure. For years, he had tried to make peace with both versions of Jerry, the man the world loved and the man the family feared. But peace never came. And with each passing year, the silence felt less like protection and more like betrayal. Betrayal of himself. Betrayal of the truth. It was the anniversary that broke him, the 7th since Jerry's death. He had been invited to yet another tribute, a glittering affair in Hollywood where comedians lined up to praise his father's genius. The stage was lit in gold, Jerry's face plastered on giant screens, his voice booming through speakers as old clips replayed. The audience laughed, cried, stood in ovation. And his son sat there, invisible, suffocating under the weight of it all. When they played his clips, I couldn't breathe, he admitted. All I could see was the man who tore us apart, the man who made us feel worthless if we didn't meet his impossible standards. Everyone else was laughing. I was choking. That night, he went home and stared at the mirror for hours. For the first time, he admitted aloud what he had always denied. I need to tell the truth. I can't keep carrying this. It wasn't just about anger. It wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. The silence was eating him alive, locking him inside the cage his father had built long ago. Speaking out finally was a way of breaking free, not from Jerry's shadow, but from his own. Still, breaking silence was no easy act. His family warned him against it. Some feared the backlash, others feared the pain of reopening old wounds. Let it go, they said. The world won't believe you. But he couldn't let it go. He had spent too long living under the illusion of Jerry Lewis the legend, while hiding the reality of Jerry Lewis the father. The truth had to come out. There had been moments before when he almost spoke. Times when reporters pressed too hard, times when rumors swirled. But every time he backed down, afraid of what the world would think, afraid of betraying a man who, despite everything, was still his father. I didn't want to be seen as ungrateful, he explained. I didn't want to be the son who tried to tear down a hero. But by the 7th year, gratitude no longer mattered. Neither did fear. What mattered was honesty. What mattered was finally owning the story that had been stolen from him for decades. And so, when the question came, what was it like growing up as Jerry Lewis' son? He didn't dodge it. He didn't deflect. He let the truth pour out like floodwater breaking through a dam. His voice shook, his hands trembled, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The world had to know, he said. Not because I wanted to destroy him, but because I needed to free myself. The confession landed like a thunderclap. Headlines blared. Fans recoiled. Critics sharpened their knives. Some called him brave. Others called him a traitor. But none could ignore him. For the first time, Jerry Lewis' carefully maintained image cracked, and through the cracks, the truth bled out. And what his son revealed next wasn't just personal pain. It was legacy-altering. It forced the world to ask a brutal question. What is the cost of genius, and who pays it? Because in the end, it wasn't Jerry Lewis' audience who paid. It was his family. When Jerry Lewis' son finally laid bare the truth, the world had no choice but to listen. For decades, the legend had been untouchable, his flaws buried beneath mountains of applause, his cruelty muted by the glow of fame. But now, the illusion had cracked. The laughter, once so untouchable, now rang differently. It still sparkled, but there was an echo of something darker beneath it, an understanding that the man who brought joy to millions left his own children in silence and pain. The revelations didn't erase Jerry's accomplishments. They didn't undo the films, the iconic routines, the staggering sums raised for charity. Those things remained, forever etched into history. But now they existed in tension with something else, the voices of his family, who had lived a very different reality. He was brilliant, his son admitted. But brilliance doesn't erase the damage. And damage doesn't erase brilliance. Both are true. That duality became the heart of his confession. Jerry Lewis was not simply hero or villain, saint or sinner. He was both. A man capable of creating joy so powerful it could fill stadiums, and pain so sharp it could silence his own children. People want their legends clean, his son reflected. But legends are messy. My father was messy. In telling his truth, his son didn't just reclaim his own story, he reframed Jerry's. He forced the world to see the cost of genius, not just the glow. He made us confront the uncomfortable question: how much suffering behind closed doors is excused for the sake of brilliance on stage? For him, the act of speaking out was more than revelation. It was redemption. Not for Jerry, but for himself. For 7 years, he had carried guilt, resentment, and silence like shackles. Every tribute, every glowing headline, every fan who called his father a saint was another link in that chain. By finally speaking, he broke it. "I'm not telling this to hurt him," he said. "I'm telling this so it stops hurting me." The confession also sparked something unexpected: empathy. Some fans were outraged, unwilling to believe their idol had shadows. But many others understood. They saw in Jerry's story the truth of so many families, where the world sees success, but the children see something else entirely. Where the price of brilliance is paid in the quiet suffering of those closest. Letters poured in, not of condemnation, but of recognition. "You're not alone," strangers wrote. "We lived this too." And in that outpouring, Jerry Lewis' son found something he never expected: community. By sharing his story, he helped others confront theirs. The silence that had trapped him for decades was shattered, not just for him, but for countless others who saw themselves in his words. As he looked back on his father's life, his voice softened. He didn't strip Jerry of his accomplishments, nor did he deny the love he sometimes felt buried deep beneath the storms. "He was my father," he said simply. "And no matter what he did, I loved him. But loving him doesn't mean lying about him." That was the final truth, the one he had carried for too long, the one he finally freed himself by speaking. Jerry Lewis was both light and shadow. His laughter was real, but so was the silence. His brilliance was undeniable, but so was the pain. And in the end, perhaps the truest legacy of Jerry Lewis isn't just the joy he brought to the world. It's the cautionary tale of what happens when genius blinds itself to the cost at home. 7 years after his death, his son's words reshaped the story. They added depth to the myth, humanity to the legend, scars to the smile. And maybe that's how we should remember Jerry Lewis. Not as perfect, not as pure, but as real. A man who burned brighter than most, but whose fire left shadows only his family could see. And so, as we close this chapter, ask yourself, what is the price of brilliance? How do we honor the laughter without ignoring the scars? Because behind every legend, there are truths the spotlight cannot reach. And now, thanks to the courage of one son, those truths have finally been spoken. If this story moved you, if you believe the world needs to hear the truth behind the glitter, then don't let it stop here. Hit that like button right now, share this with others who need to know what really hides behind Hollywood's curtain, and subscribe for more untold stories of legends whose shadows speak louder than their spotlights. Because Jerry Lewis' laughter lit up the world, but it is his silence, broken at last by his son, that will echo long after the curtain falls. If this story moved you, if you believe the truth behind Hollywood's brightest legends deserves to be heard, then don't let it stop here. Hit that like button right now, share this video with others who want to see beyond the spotlight, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss the hidden stories behind the names you thought you knew. Because sometimes, the laughter on stage hides the deepest scars off it, and here, we reveal them all.